The title of her presentation is Ethno-Dance as a Critical Identity Tool for Black Students' Science Identity Construction. And she's a graduate from University of Illinois at Chicago. The second panelist is Ivana Pengley, and the title of her presentation is Portraiture and Arts-Based Explorations of Identity, and she's a recent graduate from Florida State University and also my advisee. The third panelist is Ern Hope, and the title of her presentation is Challenging Our Thinking in Science Education Research with Art-Based Methods, and she's from the University of Copenhagen. And then our last panelist is Dr. Eleanor S. Armstrong, and she's a postdoc fellow at Stockholm University, and the title of her presentation is Recreating Space Science Narratives, Signs as Counterculture Pedagogy. So we're going to go ahead and start in the order that I presented the panelists. So Mindy Chappell, you are our first panelist.
Amal?
Yes.
Just to let everybody know, sorry, before we have made a Padlet.
Oh, that's right. Thank you for reminding me.
Of course, I just posted it in the chat, but it's just so that when you listen to the panelists, you have the possibility to write questions, and we have time in the end for questions and answers. So just, yeah, feel free to add your questions to the panel along the way.
Good morning, everyone. Are we ready? All right. So good morning, everyone. My name is Mindy Chappell. I am an assistant professor at Portland State University, and I am thankful to Sarah, especially SIG5, and the rest of you for your presence. The title of this presentation is Ethno-Dance as a Critical Identity Tool for Black Students' Science Identity Construction. Although progress has been made over the last few decades, for many Black people, science spaces remain sites of racial inequities and oppression experiences. And instead of spaces where they actualize academic success and develop and maintain a cultural competency and develop a critical consciousness through which they can challenge the status quo of the current social order. Thus, research that seeks to understand the experiences of Black youth and their social, cultural, historical context within science education is critical in order to transform structures that work to maintain an equitable and othering experiences. One way that research can shift to better understand the experiences of Black youth in science education is by looking at multiple modes of communication and their potential for conveying powerful identity stories in science education. As one particular mode of communication, dance as an interwoven part of social life for many Black youth transcends the act of performance to become a liberating tool for storing their experiences. Thus, emerging from my intersecting science and dance identity, this study uses the relationship between dancer and student to examine how students use ethno-dance to author and narrate their evolving science identity through their experiences in high school. To frame ethno-dance as a methodological approach, I link arts-based research with the theory of multimodality. To provide the framing for considering dance as a valuable form of construction expression, I use the construct Black dance to articulate the critical expressive nature of dance. I then weave these three bodies of literature together to define what I call ethno-dance, an arts-based methodological approach with certain affordances regarding the identity and identity construction of students with developed dancer identities. I use arts-based research to foreground the potential of these non-discursive means of knowing and meaning making. As a specific mode of artistic representation that centers around the body and its movement in time and space, I use dance to honor the dialectic relationship between the body and its social, cultural, historical, political, and physical environment. I use the construct Black dance to center dance within the lives and experiences of Black people from a social and historical lens. I use the term Black dance to honor the people and unique movement of the African diaspora and to show the centrality of dance as a form of expression, cultural solidarity, understanding, and resistance for Black bodies. To understand the experiences of youth as they engage in science learning, I explore their identity construction. I combine identity theory with social identity theory to explore the ways that people position themselves and how they are positioned by others as they narrate their experiences. This allows me to study how students' identities are shaped by the structures within science, their agency, and the agency of others. I link these bodies of literature to compose a conceptual framework that allows me to study how dance, and specifically what I coined as ethnodance, offer ways to construct and communicate identities of Black students in science classrooms. Specifically, I look at dance as an artistic representation, which allows a dynamic breaking and remaking of the experience, which becomes both data and interpretation and interpretive studies of identity and identity construction. I combine narrative inquiry with arts-based research to position dance as an embodied representation of one's narrative. The 5 participants in this study were Black high school students with developed dancer identities who attended a predominantly Latinx neighborhood school. 2 of them studied chemistry and AP physics, and they all studied biology and physics. At the time of this study, they were alumni members of a majorette dance team where I was referred to as Miss Chap Chap. As a science teacher and a trusted adult in their lives, I wanted to use dance to offer them an authentic and liberating way to create, narrate, and portray analysis of their experiences in science classes, coupled with the tensions, triumphs, and emotions of crafting oneself through what I call ethnodance. In this way, my research aims to explore the authentic voices of Black youth through liberating and empowering narratives, counter-narratives, and re-singing. The data for this study came from a variety of sources. Participants orchestrated their narrative in written form and choreographed a dance, which became their ethnodance. Videography of their ethnodance stood as a source of interpretation and triangulation during the oral conversations. Additionally, I used a modified version of Tinkler's photo technique to capture students' interpretations of the still images that they snapped from their ethnodance. Lastly, my ethnographic knowledge as their former dance coach, former teacher, and trusted adult is embedded within all aspects of the data sources. The analysis was informed by narrative inquiry and arts-based practices, coupled with Tinkler's proposed method of photo elicitation analysis, all which illuminated aspects of ways of being in the world marked by one's own exploration and representation, and thus giving voice to and highlighting the voice of people themselves. This table provides a sample of salient aspect of participants' ethnodance that became important in analysis. The dance genre, selected song to accompany the dance, salient choreographic features of the dance, the experience represented by the dance and the primary highlighted meaning of the experience, and the mood of that part of the dance performance captured by both the experience and its interpretation by the student and its representation via the dance. I then examine each part of the performance and the meanings communicated to attend to the 3 meta functions of a communicative system: ideational, interpersonal, and textual. Here you can see a summary of the codes, the code families, and their associated meta function, along with an example of a discourse excerpt from a student's oral conversation and its corresponding student selected photo artifact. 3 things emerged during the analysis of their ethnodances. I found that ethnodance offers students with developed dancer backgrounds opportunities to use planned and unplanned choreography to construct and narrate their experiences. I'll present an ethnodance of their analysis of each theme, followed by explicit examples from their data.
Dance is my medicine. It is the scream which eases for a while the terrible frustration common to all people who, because of race, creed, or color, are invisible. Dance is the fist I fight the sickening ignorance of prejudice. Instead of growing twisted like a gnarled tree inside myself, I am able to dance out my anger and frustration.
Ethno-dance emerged as a critical identity tool for students with intersecting dancer science identities to construct, narrate, and author who they saw themselves as in science. In doing so, they foregrounded the power of dance as a critical tool to construct and narrate their experiences in science with respect to choosing the mode of communication, the genre of the dance, and the performance location. Moreover, their agentic choice allowed them to express themselves in authentic and liberating ways. Jasmine explicitly mentioned how the dance allowed her to better express herself in a way that was challenging to do in writing. Dance offered Jasmine a form of expressing more about her science identity, whereas in language, trying to figure out the words was not easy or possible. Illustrative in her discourse excerpt, Jasmine struggled to find words to narrate her experiences in written form, while the ethno-dance allowed her an opportunity to convey transitioning to her beast mode and pushing through her struggles in physics. For her, the ethno-dance was a space to illustrate who she was becoming in physics, illuminating the interconnectedness between her dancer and science self. Lawson used ethno-dance to author his experiences and convey who he was and who he was becoming as a dancer and a person. The ethno-dance was a space for Lawson to be his whole unapologetic self in school, revealing who he wanted people to see when they saw him and his dance performance. Lawson's excerpt also portrays the devastating and seemingly debilitating feeling of not being able to express themselves through dance for a dancer, which speaks to the importance of one's chosen mode of expressivity in their identity construction, authoring, and life. Students' sense-making with and of their ethno-dance emphasize aspects of the structure agency dialectic within their identity narratives. They noted specific school-based structures that hindered or impacted their academic progress or engagement in science. They also highlighted the ways that their agency enabled them to push against or maneuver around these structures. For Jasmine, the practice of physics emerged as a structural impediment to her academic success due to the math-heavy nature of physics. Despite her efforts, she could never get an A. This reference to getting an A shows how the school-based grading policy impacted Jasmine's science identity in terms of who she was in physics. Though she was earning a C or a B in physics, her science identity was contested because she could not see herself as successful in physics without earning an A. The 3 kicks that she performed in this segment, she said, represented her agency, the power that I had and the courage that I had to advocate for myself and to ask the teacher for extra credit or to redo assignment or a test or a better study guide so that she can get a better grasp of physics with math. Tiffany positioned herself as a mediator to transform or question the school's decision for her class to begin their science journey with environmental science. On the one hand, watching her ethno-dance and reflecting created an opportunity for Tiffany to realize that as a student, she had agency to advocate for herself and her class regarding their science course sequence. On the other hand, Tiffany's extension highlighted a disconnect between her imagined and her actual agency that was limited by the school's decision-making power. Tiffany's class was not given space to provide input regarding the change prior to the change happening. So Tiffany's bent over hip swaying move to represent not being the advocate or speaking up assumed she could have shifted her program structure. In actuality, there was little to nothing that she could have done to transform this critical structure impediment to her science success and her experience in physics. Students use forms of Black dance, specifically majorette and hip hop, to represent salient moments of their experiences, positioning their ethno dance as sites of solidarity and cultural expressivity. Specifically, Jasmine embodied the power and the structure, Jasmine embodied the power and the courage that she had via majorette. Devin authored her teacher-recognized self-affirmed science identity with majorette. Lawson's transition from contemporary to majorette represented the emergence of his confirmed and confident "this is me" identity. Conversely, students use lyrical or contemporary dance to represent experiences that challenged or nuanced their position in science. Farah set her "one of these days" movements to lyrical, and Lawson's negotiated identity within the school was illustrated using contemporary dance. So ethno dance became a structure for students with dance identities to narrate evolving science identities and communicate meanings, interactions, and emotions, and construct them further as reified artifacts of their experiences in school and specifically science. In doing so, their ethno dances were multimodal small stories, opportunities to construct a sense of who people are, vis-a-vis particular contexts and interactions and particular roles. Their ethno dance was also an embodiment of the dialectic relationship between structure and agency, where students authored who they were becoming in science and the structures that challenged their position. As a unified cultural aesthetic, Black dance provided an avenue for these dancers to build a sense of cultural solidarity, as well as navigate the constraints of mainstream dance to convey their story, similar to how they navigated boundaries and constraints of science to take up active membership. So as someone who believes that when given a platform, you're responsible for what you do with that platform, I choose to use my research to understand the experiences of youth of color, especially Black youth in science education, to help transform structures and practices and ideologies. As a Black female scholar and researcher, I choose to study the experiences of people marginalized by society as a member of the margins, as a form of resistance and a rally cry that the lives of those of us who would exist in the margins matter. In this way, students will be supported in working towards liberation and freeing themselves from the narratives of underperformance, deficiency, despair, cultivating avenues to reshape their lived experiences and the world around them. For Black youth, this is long overdue. Thus, I welcome your thought-provoking questions regarding my research. Thank you.
Thank you, Mindy. And now we're going to move to Ivana. And just a reminder, the Padlet that Katya shared, where you can post your questions so that before the end of the panel, that's where we will look at thoughts, questions that you have for the panelists.
Ivana Pengelly. I am a recent graduate and very grateful to be under the leadership of Dr. Mel Igor. So today I'm going to go into the methods of my dissertation research. I was very excited to hear, thank you, Dr. Chappelle, for what you shared. In my journey through academia, I have independently, randomly come into the dance world as a way of further understanding myself. It was kind of I guess, an outlet for this type of work. But the type of research that is done in our art spaces on campus has shifted the way I view the world, both in a research perspective, but also in my own world, right? There was a lot of information that I was taking in from these practices of exploration in the dance world that were feeding me information, right? Like as I'm moving through the world. So let's see. So I don't know, in my journey, I both had that experience, and I also had the opportunity to take an arts-based research course in the art ed department. And that also brought into my perspective the ways that we can take these practices of art as practices of science to understand the world, trace the world around us. So I come to this work from a science education background. I come to science education from a very engaged, I love the world around me. I care about the outdoors, I care about people. And so asking questions makes sense to me, right? Because that's the way to move forward into the world that I want to see. All right. Next. For this work, as I searched how I could do this, I turned to what made sense for me in my own world. Black feminist theory has provided guidance to both how I could move through this process in academia and also the importance of asking certain questions, right? So this framework says we live in a social environment where everything is intertwined. And so we will ask questions, but the questions we ask are shaped by our perspectives. And so everything is situated, right? We know this is very philosophical background to academia. And so the importance of asking questions from Black women, our perspective on the questions, and of other Black women provides specific information about Blackness and about feminineness, about gender, about our experiences in this world that has placed meaning on what these things are. Now, the meaning is dependent on so many things, right? So everyone has a different experience based on all the things that we bring. And so if we can go ahead and unpack the actual experiences that are happening and then the things that are connected to those experiences, there is a wealth of information that we will learn. So that's the framework for this. Another tool that I drew on as I was working to be like, okay, well, I want this to be for something. I want this work to be oriented around growth. And so Afrofuturism is another perspective within academia that looks at what would it look like to imagine a world in which Blackness is not the bottom of the barrel, right? So where our power dynamics are different. What could this look like if it wasn't the way it was now? So with these questions, I'm like, okay, working from this direction, what can this tell me about identity? What can this tell me about practices of science? What would the world look like if we could do it differently using these perspectives? This is a just an additional piece that has come to me as I have continued to unpack this work. And so then I look at, okay, here's a book, How to See Yourself as You Really Are. And the titles of each section are very, just see if you notice anything from these titles. So The Need for Insight, Part 1. Why understanding truth is needed, discovering the source of problems, laying the ground for insight to grow. Part 2, how to undermine ignorance. Okay, this is really interesting. This is where it like gets into how can we dig deeper? And I found in the science identity research that I had like explored in, there were very common responses. And it is no surprise that girls are saying, well, our interests there are not spaces for our interests. The ways we want to do things are not being supported. I want to do science because I want to help the world. Girls get further into this pathway, right? They're kind of knocked out for different reasons, culturally, all sorts of reasons along the way. Girls will get into careers, women will become scientists, and there continues to be pushback that they receive in the world on the type of work, the work environment, their sense of belonging, their satisfaction in this field, right? There's pathways that people can find, and when those pathways exist, there's typically very specific supports in place, right? There's ways that people feel connected to the group that they're working with and the type of work that they're doing. Other than that, then it's a pretty external. Science is a practice that looks like people in a lab coat. It looks like an older man with glasses. Research turns this up over and over when we ask children, what does it look like to do science? So I'm looking at this perspective of like, okay, this is the landscape out there. There's a lot of information about how we do science, who does science, and what it feels like to do science, and what the science looks like. So I'm like imagining what else could it look like? And essentially I come to, what would it look like to do science in a different way for a different purpose? In a different way, okay, we could use arts, right? We just went through how powerful that dance practice was for people to both surface their ideas, their experiences, to put them into a narrative form, to express them to someone, to themselves, to each other, and to have the space to look at that, right? There was reflection of, okay, what is going on in these spaces? And so now participants are naming these experiences and they're discussing them with each other. So that is another practice of science, right? We come together to talk about these things and what did you learn? What did you learn? Okay, and then informs the next process of our explorations. It's like, all right, so we could use art to do science, and the person, like what type of science, that I wanted to keep very open. Like if we could do science, what would we want to explore? I have found that most people tend to want to start with the self, which was that little hint forward. So this was back over like, what are the elements of science? What does it mean to do science, right? So we just talk through these, ask the questions, get the data, check in, do it again. So all of these elements in mind, my study, the way I put it together, I worked in partnership with an art therapist. So I don't come from an art background. I don't have dance as the practice that is my natural language. Essentially, words, writing, reading. I was a reader. Now I've learned through this process to be more expressive, to be a writer, what it means to be a writer, how to use that art form. But so I, as someone who didn't have an art practice, turned to someone who works with others to use art, whether or not they're artists, to surface information about themselves, go through a process of reflection, and use that information to shift. So there's a whole lot of additional research kind of behind how that process happens, and it's its own thing, right? A dissertation is huge, but in practicality, that is what we were able to do. That was the tool I could bring to participants, to myself, and we went through a process. I worked with 7 young Black women who are in high school, who also identified as scientists in whichever way. And so we found, some of them also had taken some advanced courses. They liked science from childhood. They asked questions. Their parents talked about what type of, like how they saw their children and what types of engagement. So you could really get this sense of what being a scientist meant. We surfaced that through all of the activities that we asked them to do. Draw yourself as a scientist. What did your childhood look like? We had a lot of conversations about what came up. So it was this back and forth process. So art as the process for me to gather data, really sitting with that same question with participants. What does it mean to do science? I was trying to get at their science identity, how they saw themselves as scientists and how others saw them. That's like how we define what science identity is. What you do in science, how you see yourself as a scientist, how others see you as a scientist. So anything I could do to uncover that story was where we went. And so as we sat with those questions about what does it mean to do science, and they understood what we were doing with this art making process, they, in the final phase of our work with them, were invited to do their own investigations. However you wanted to do it, we would support you in this process. And we had talked through other interests. They had interest in animal research and food research, environmental things, right? They had interests. And as we had gone through our weeks together of doing really practical science work, uncovery work, at the end, they chose to do similar work. And they chose to focus on what their lives look like. So for a period of 2 weeks, they each designed studies of what they would track. And we had all types of things happen along this program. Participation, what's happening in the day-to-day lives of the participants, how they came to work with me, and what that looked like over time. There were so many elements to this story. So those are part of what my whole narrative, my reflections include. That's what the methodology of portraiture is about. That is me as a writer, researcher, artist, engaging with the community deeply. It's ethnographic work. Over time, surfacing artifacts, going deep, asking why in interview questions to understand as much as I can, and then put the information together in a narrative. That is the methodology of portraiture. So I offered 3 portraits at the end of my study. I focused on 2 participants who were able to complete all the way through the program. Right, so I said there's other things going on, so that's in the story. I have the story of the entire experience. That's the 3rd portrait I offer. So that's where I can add my commentary about what is going on. Why do we see 2 participants at the end of the day? What did that look like for everyone along the way? And they were engaged. Everyone, as they participated, offered their insights, their questions. We worked as a collaborative, and so the information was shared as a group. You could see our thinking develop over time. And I don't know, there's so many details that are in this story, so I can't get into all of them. But it was a process that allowed me and us to, we gained a lot of information, right? That was, the girls used the information for their own purposes. The 2 participants who designed their self-study focused on their daily lives. So from the moment they woke up, what were they doing? What were they thinking? And then what did they do with that? And they noticed shifts, particularly in their relationships. That was the thing that shifted for them. The concerns they had, the things that they exercised, they talked to their sisters, they did this. They established their goals, right? And they had a chance to track information and they moved forward on them. So very exploratory, very theoretical approach, very let's get into a new experience and draw on some tools and see what we can find. I look forward to continuing this work and to scaling, to having longer time periods, to engaging with others around nuance in what could be further explored. But overall, we did have an experience that was fruitful and essentially, there's just some level of self, resourcing that drew us back to the work, and the work has continued. It's been a year since I've worked with the girls. They are further on into their journeys. One is enrolled in the university, another has other academic barriers, and that was very consistent in her story and important information for the reflection.
Ivana, just to remind you, you have about 4 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. Well, and so I would like to close with a moment. We can take the last 4 minutes to go ahead and take some breaths. This is where the work was about doing things differently, right? And so at many different levels, in an active, personal application of science. That is how we were thinking outside of the restraints, outside of the tradition. And so I would ask you now to also engage yourself in taking 3 breaths, getting clear inside yourself, and then looking at these questions and writing for yourself as much as comes up for yourself. And you could just move through the questions. And to bring this to a close, I'd like you to really think on the last question about what are your tools? What are the things that give you information? And you might not know the answer to that yet, or you might have something that you do regularly. This is always about the deepening of a practice. How can we make connections from other spaces and continue to just kind of bring things into alignment as we want something to be different? Where are the spaces in our current realities that we need to make the shifts? And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana. All right, next on our panel list is Eleanor.
Okay, so just to make sure, do you see the PowerPoint with or without notes?
We see it with notes.
With notes, okay, we'll just switch then. 1 second. So that is better, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. First of all, thank you for the invitation, SIG5, and also just nice to see so many people participating here today. So as mentioned, my presentation will be about challenging our thinking in science education research with art-based methods. So first, a short introduction. I am a PhD student, and my project is about the transition from 6th grade to 7th grade in the primary Danish school. And I explore this transition because the pupils' day goes from having 1 science subject to have 3 new science subjects in 7th grade. I'm placed at the Department of Science Education at the University of Copenhagen. But my PhD is also a collaboration between the University of Copenhagen and the College University of Copenhagen, where the teachers are educated. And today, my presentation will take outset in this article, Art-Based Research Methods in Science Education Research, a systematic review of their prevalence and an analysis of the potential in addressing complex questions. So this article I have done together with my supervisor, Henriette Holmegård, and it is accepted by the journal Nordina. Yes. So how and why? So how did I end up looking into these art-based methods? So in my work, I often use interviews as methods to produce data, but interviews also rely on our verbal skills. And in my case, I do interviews with kids and young people. And here, these verbal skills can be a barrier or constraint when you try to share something, So I thought about, okay, how can I meet these young kids and young people and provide them with a space where they can express their knowledge, which is less depending on the verbal skills. And also in my case, how can they talk about knowledge related to science? And it was in this relation or in this kind of reflection that I started to explore what art might offer science education research. Yes, and then the aim of the paper. So the aim of this paper is twofold. So what we were interested in was to understand if art-based methods had gained ground in science education. And then we also did an analysis of how does these methods provide something new, or what kind of knowledge do they provide when we are using them. And in this presentation, I will emphasize the last part. So we'll look more into what this method can offer or support our research in science education research. And I think it's important to say that this article is a methodological perspective, which means that I look into how these methods can support other kind of methods like the interview and like the ethnographic fieldwork. Then I also think it's important to say that in this article, we distinguish between science education research and science education teaching. And we do that because when we started this article, we saw that a lot of science teachers, they are using these creative, visual and performative approaches when they teach in science. Yeah, so what do I mean when I say art-based methods? So digging into these art-based methods, I became aware that this wasn't just a little handful of methods, but it was a landscape where there was this all this kind of use of these artistic approaches who have multiple forms. So I just want to provide you with a little glimpse of how art-based method can look like and what I mean when I talk about it. So something could be painting and drawing. It could also be photographs, but it could also be using Lego or video diary. And it could also be using music songs, or it could be using poetry and essays. So this is just a very short glimpse of it. So, and for me, it's also like, one thing is to choose one of these methods. Another thing is how you're using it. You might use photograph. You might bring something as a researcher into the interview situation, some pictures, or you might let the participant take the pictures. You might guide them for what you want them to take pictures of, or you might not. So there's all these kind of possibilities. And for me, it show how full this this landscape is when choosing methods and then choose how to work with it. Yeah, so back to the paper. So as I mentioned, we did this analysis in our paper, and in this analysis, 4 themes, they became clear, or like they appeared from a lot of the papers that we went through. And the 4 themes are knowledge through the artifacts, nonverbal language, power and positions, time to reflect. All these themes have some under subcategories, and I'm not going to talk about them all here today. I just want to show you some of them and mention some of the things that we could see. So the first one is knowledge through the artifacts. And what I find really important here is that when we start using these artifacts, we bring something in between us as researcher and the participants. There will be this kind of medium. And this might trigger something. It could be old memories. It could be a feeling, a place that we once visited, that this is showing up through the artifact. Then we can also talk about the bodily commitment. And I think like the presentation Mandy did is really showing out what we can say when we talk about a bodily commitment. Because this is also to say, okay, through our bodies, we learn something. We can also express what we know and the knowledge that we have. We can do that with our body. But it's also the basically thing like holding something, that you can squeeze something, you can explore it, you can turn it around. It gives you some kind of connection to something else that is not only depending on language. Yes, and then I'll just skip over these 2 and then talk about this nonverbal language. So what we did here was that we looked into, can we minimize language when we do research, when we produce data? And this is not to say that language is irrelevant, but it's more to say that it don't have to set the scene for the empirical data. It's more like in the background, and then later it may gonna have, you're gonna use it to dig into what you have maybe drawn or taking pictures of. But then also this idea about moving beyond language, it could be like challenge you will face sometimes when you wanna say something, pronouncing something, you can forget words and that. So it's also a idea to say, okay, let's place language over in the corner just for a while, and then start looking into other ways that we can express ourselves, that we can express the knowledge we know or the things we want to say, but through a drawing instead. Yes, and then also I think one of the things that I have learned is that it's also providing the space for different kind of participations. You don't have to participate in a certain kind of way. You can do all different kind of things when you want to draw, when you want to use Lego, or if you want to take pictures. Yes, and then there is also like the theme about power and position. And here we can talk about challenge our position as a researcher. The idea is also like sharing power. Instead of us going into an interview and ask a lot of questions that we want our participant to answer, we can also give them a feeling of ownership, a feeling of responsibility if they are the one who brings something into the interview. And also this idea about letting them being the expert, but also as a researcher, take this step back. Don't be so intrusive as a researcher. We necessarily don't need to be at the same place when a young person take pictures of what they are doing, or if they bring something, they can also like produce data without us, and then we can talk about it when they bring it back to an interview situation. And then there's also the whole idea about time, this idea about time to reflect. Often when we talk, we have this kind of ping pong, like I ask something, and then you'll answer me. And in this case, this idea of using the artifacts is also a way to embrace slowness. Like it's okay to stop up. It's okay to look at what I'm doing right now with the drawing. Do I want to add something, or do I want to delete something that is on the drawing right now? But it's also a way to take, maybe when we share something, take that away from us and put it into the artifact. And then we can talk about stuff that might be vulnerable for us to talk about. And then I think one of the things also, like, you might in the end have a product, but it's also the whole idea about the process. What happens through this this way of using these artistic approaches? What happened when we choose colors? What happened when we choose when we want to take a picture of? Yes, and then some examples. So in my project, I have done these workshops, and I call them creative workshops. And now I want to show, I do like 4 activities during the workshops, and I want to share 2 activities with the now in this presentation. Cool. So the first activity I did with the pupils was that I told them that it was decided to remove science from the schedule. So in 6th grade, it was not mandatory to have science anymore, but instead it was something that the pupil could choose. So I asked them to do this commercial that they could show to pupils in 5th grade so that they would choose science in 6th grade. And the first thing you see is the student who made this, where you can like take like a note if you want to like choose science in 6th grade. But the pupil did also wrote things like, if you choose science, you will be really smart because you're going to learn about all these things going on in the world. And she also wrote something like, you are a smart person if you choose this, but remember there's only few spots, so you have to be fast to get like a spot in science. Then one of the other pupils did this paper plane where the pupil wrote flying ideas, and then also inside wrote some things like how to handle extreme vulnerable technologies. And then I also in this activity brought some old magazines that they were allowed to take stuff from, and the pupil who had made this commercial did that and wrote things like, you need to choose science. Everybody loves science. And then also did something which was really fun. The pupil wrote, we kill trolls, which was interesting because through the some of the other outcomes I have from this workshop, the pupil, they do this. They talk about, if you don't choose science, this guy will die. So I also think there is something like they use this kind of humor or ironic things when they want to say something and it might don't have anything to do with science. But 3 things I really want to say about this. So the one thing is how different this way of participating, this way of working with the task is. And I also think this show what they want to share, but also what they find meaningful in working with this kind of task. And then the other thing is this kind of twisted humor, that they show me a glance of their world, what they find fun or what they may find ridiculous. And also something they do, they go beyond what's allowed. The things about talking about killing something is not something they can do when they are being taught. But in this situation, they were like, let's see if we can go, if she go along with this, which I find really interesting. And the other thing is also like in these activities, I try to be less controlling. I really try not to go into their process, their making process. So I try to take this step back and then be, okay, let's see what happened when I give them these possibilities or options to work with these tasks in these workshops. Yes, and then back to the title for my presentation. So challenging our thinking in science education research with art-based methods. So I think for me, looking into this field and digging into all these methods, I thought about like, one thing is what we see when we're out there doing observation, when we're doing our field work. Another thing is what we are being told when we talk with the participants, when we interview them. And then there's a third thing, is what art-based methods provides of ways for the participants to express the seen and the told in other forms. And just to unfold what I mean with that, I want to share something from my project. So some of the pupils that I'm following right now, which I have seen in the class when I'm doing observation and when I'm interviewing them. There is this one girl, and she's what you can call almost non-participating in science. She also told me in the interview that she was not that interested in science, and that it was like not something for her. Sometimes she liked it when they talked about things related to her own life, but else she wasn't like hyped about the science thing. But then I asked them in this workshop to draw themselves in science. And she did this drawing where she started to draw herself. And then she wrote things like, you're creative, you get smarter, you can talk, you do experiments, and you will be active. And I find this super interesting, because does these words say something of how she sees science? Or are they more related to how she sees herself in science, which is like contradict to what I have been seeing in my observations? Then another example is this boy in the class. He tried to participate. I wouldn't say that it's always a succeeded kind of participation, but it doesn't stop him from trying to say something. And in the interview, he do also talk about what he finds interesting with science and how he can relate some of the things. But when I saw his drawing, he had drawn himself sleeping in science, which I think is expressing this really strong feeling of you're there, but you're not there. And I think just to sum up for these two things, so for me, these drawings, they are challenging my data I have produced through the interviews and the observations. During this activity, I tried to be less intrusive. I tried to share my position of power, and I tried to provide a space to them to reflect about this activity and a way to talk about science in a non-scientific way. And for me, this provides me with this critical perspective into my data, into understand my data in new ways and in new perspectives, which I'm just starting on right now in my analysis. But it really like giving my this kind of triangulation that I have my interviews, I have my observations, and I also have these creative approaches to try to look into my data. Yes, yeah, that was everything from me. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have about 8 minutes in the panel, but as Allison mentioned, please post any thoughts, questions you have for the panelists, but we'll take maybe a question now.
Yeah, and maybe one for all of the participants. There's one question about your positionality and how working with these different kinds of methods have changed how you see yourself as a science identity researcher and your role in science education. Maybe one of you want to have a shot of that.
I can chime in that, as I said before, it's been a very personal process for me. These are tools that I'm using in my day-to-day life to do my own reflection and sorting through what's beneath the surface for things and tracking that for myself as someone who cares about the world, who's interested in questions. I easily can find myself pulled in many directions of what I want to do. And because, right, there's reasons to follow a pathway in science, there's reasons to do this and to do that, but to get clear on a process that's self-directed, this has been the work for me, and that connects to freedom, right? There's like very concrete things out of that practice. I'll leave it at that.
And I can jump in here too. I cut it out due to timing, but I usually also share a ethno dance of my researcher positionality, which builds off choreography and discussion from Pearl Premise that talks about using dance as medicine, as a way of communicating when you are faced with different things. So as a Black female woman in science, dance is a very central part of how I naturally express myself. And so I share that as a form of working against the ways that, you know, people have been exoticized or harmed in dance. also acknowledging that my research has an ethnographic nature. So when most people see ethno dance, they assume that it means ethnic. It's not, it's ethnographic. And that I understand that in order to really be able to have a window into the experiencing aspect of people's stories, I need to spend some time with them learning not only the dance, but how they use dance to communicate and understanding their experiences and being engrossed in it.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of build maybe like a slightly different perspective, which is that it's really brought me into a different community of scientists as well. Many of the people who make the zines that I'm working with are scientists in their lives outside of being zinesters. And I would be really interested to know if that's maybe the case with I thought this was really something that Mindy touched on as well, is bringing you into contact with scientists who are also dancers and dancers who are also scientists in your students. And I think it's really interesting to think about this as a way of pluralizing also what we think of as a scientist and the multidimensionality of science identity in our peers, rather than just learners in the communities that we might be working in science education. So that's something this has really done for me as well.
So I can also just add something. I don't have a background in science, but a background in education and philosophy. So I think for me, using these creative approaches is also to be aware of a lot of young people. They have a lot of knowledge that they would like to share, but it's not always easily to do that by talking. And therefore also using these approaches can be a way of saying, but it's okay. There's other ways that you can do that. There's other ways that you can share and that you can show what you know. So I think for me, it's extending this idea of how we understand science, but also how we can share our knowledge about science.
Thank you. I think, Ellie, you also have a comment for all of you. Maybe you can elaborate on that yourself, maybe.
Yeah, I just wrote I was just really struck during the final talk that the something that really comes through in these creative methods is the tension of kind of affect against what we might think of as affective science. And yeah, I was just thinking about why do creative methods perhaps give us a space to talk about affect in science and in science education. This particularly came to me when we're talking about humor. I've recently been thinking about space science is always talked about as being inspiring. So I'm recently thinking about what does to be inspired mean as an affective emotion. And Mindy, I really saw this in your presentation, talking about the frustration that students were experiencing. As a way of really getting through that. And I was just thinking that this, I hadn't really thought about this as a tension between maybe hegemonic science education and this kind of creative practice, but it's been really interesting to kind of draw these together and think about this at large. So yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm taking the space.
No, thank you very much for that thought, Ellie. I think we are running to the end of our time, and there are some questions for all of you in the Padlet. So I'll just encourage all of our panelists. Maybe you could write answers or chip in the Padlet for the questions that we didn't have time to go around. Thank you so much, and I think Katie will wrap up.
Yes, I'll be brief. Thank you to all of our panelists. That was amazing. There's lots of comments about how inspired, how interesting, just 4 really great discussions. So thank you so much. You have given us so much to think about in terms of how we conceive of science, science education research. I know I'm going to be thinking about this all day at least, so thank you for that. But also you've given us a lot to think about in terms of how we resist some of these narratives of what science is and what science education is and who we are as researchers. And I think that's something that really struck me throughout all 4 of these talks, as well as ways to broaden participation in science, broaden who can be a scientist, what we think of as science through our research, which I think is what's been so inspiring about these talks. So I want to thank you again to all 4 of our presenters. Please do take time of, follow up on the Padlet with other questions. I know this conversation could go on for a lot longer. But thank you all for our attendees too for joining us, and stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have more amazing panels like this year. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Oh, I guess we're still recording.